WCLN 1170 Radio and Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. We Should Know is on there. I want to thank you for your comments from last week's show. A very interesting show talking about substance abuse, and I want to thank our guests for driving in to be on that show. And I've had a number of people ask me, are we going to do an expansion of that? Possibly later on we'll come in and maybe move into the stage of psychology and psychiatry to talk a little bit about that in a little bit more detail. Today we're talking with two folks that have driven in from out of county again. Dr. Mark Megalis, who is, Mark, I want to kind of just give a quick rundown on your background. Obviously you're with North Carolina State University, and we're going to be talking about forestry stuff today, but you got a PhD in forestry, you've got a master's in forest science, you got a Bachelor of Science degree in natural resources and management in forestry. You've got an extensive academic credentials, and you're also an extension associate professor at North Carolina State University. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Colby Lambert, thank you for coming. You've got 30 plus counties here in eastern North Carolina that you look after and answer technical questions and issues related to the forestry business and industry in eastern North Carolina. And I looked at some of those counties in the road map. If you have to be on site a lot of times, you spend some time on the road, I guess, do you
Yes,
not?
sir.
Well,
Sure
thank
do.
you for taking time to be with us today. I want to talk about what sometimes numbers, I guess, gentlemen, is one of those things that you can get a little bit fuzzy with, but somewhere 10 billion plus domestic income from forestry in North Carolina. When I look at that, I want to kind of start big picture and think about it when we look at forestry, whether we own forest land or we do not. How important is forestry and the forestry industry to us, and how much does it touch and impact everybody's life? And I'll start with you, Dr. McGowan.
Okay, glad to do that. And some of our colleagues at NC State just completed a research study to answer that question. And the answer is a pretty substantial one. Nearly $30 billion comes to North Carolina annually through our forest-based industries. And so that can be lumber mills that we know about, the paper mills. Where Colby and I spend a lot of our time is working with the private landowners who control most of this land. 6 out of every 10 acres in the state, or some 19 million acres, are owned by private individuals or forest industry. But the biggest share of that are private individuals. So if we can keep them economically viable, put money in their pocket, they're really moving the state forward. So we are behind maybe 1 or 2 manufacturing entities, agriculture, textiles, for instance, but forestry is number 3. So that $30 billion is quite a nest egg, and we want to keep that going as part of the extension team.
Colby, when I look at kind of what you do, and of course you've got a Bachelor of Science degree in forest management, and you are kind of what I call the extension specialist when it comes to a tree, if that makes any sense at all in my mind. So generally speaking, in the big picture of things, what are some of the key kinds of issues you address kind of on a regular basis here in the 30 plus counties that you are engaged with on a regular basis? I know that one of the things that I'm asked about oftentimes, and this is just somewhat of a general question, but it does have some specifics to it, is that when do I cut a tree? Because folks will say, I've seen trees going down the road on log trucks that look like they were 8 or 10 inches in diameter. I've seen some trees going to look like they were maybe 2 foot or 3 foot in diameter. What's the answer to that if somebody has timberland?
Well, it's very specific as to their own tract of timber, depending on when it was planted, whether it was harvested in natural regeneration, or if it was planted as a plantation, whether it's been thinned, whether it needs thinning. Market conditions certainly contribute a big part of that decision, but also their own financial stability. Their own financial situation makes a makes a big difference in whether or not they should cut or shouldn't cut.
You've had experience in the western part of the state as well as now the eastern part of the state. The growing conditions in various parts of the state because of climate. I've had a friend of mine who's a horticulturist on, and we talk about plants and how different plants grow in various parts of the state. There's different kinds of trees that have different value. What would you consider the most valuable tree? Either somebody's going to plant 20 plus acres, or if they're just say, well, I've got a certain kind of tree. What has the most value? Hardwood, pines? Is there a specific species?
Well, there are certain species that are certainly more valuable than others, depending on their soil conditions, their soil types, their site conditions. That really dictates what they should and should not plant on that property. Not really so much the value of certain tree species, but whether or not that land will actually grow that tree or not.
And that's important, I think, but there's also this thing, and I've noticed it, and in fact, I had somebody ask me, say, ask these guys this question, and because they have, as I have seen, for some reason I have seen a lot of nut-bearing trees, pecan, or depending on what part of the world you're from, it's pecan around here, it might be pecan in New Jersey, Dr. McGillis, but it's, is there something going on there that we need to know about? Is there a golden something at the end of the rainbow with these pecan trees, or what? Anybody? Either one of you.
Well, I mean, the beauty of a nut tree is that it's going to have a crop every year.
Yeah.
And that's something different than most of our forest trees. We've got to wait and make a long-term investment with whether it's a pine or a hardwood. Some of the hardwoods would take 60 years to come to fruition. But a nut tree on the right site with the right management, I guess the returns could be comparable to what folks get from tobacco, an acre.
That'd be pretty
But
substantial.
there's a long teenage trial year where they need to get mature and lots of sprays and those kind of things. But
And I think too that with the local food movement that's been going on in this state, you're seeing a lot more people that want to know where their food's coming from. So just like with blueberries and blackberries and other types of berries, your nut trees, people are wanting to know where those come from as well. So I think that's why you're seeing a lot more of those planted too.
You know, I always, when I get somebody that's specializing, like both you guys do, in a specific area, it's always kind of intriguing to me to kind of just ask the question, what kind of pulled you in to focusing on, for example, forestry? Both of you've got degrees and various levels of degrees and speciality in forestry, and we find that obviously with universities and stuff where you have people that focus on certain areas. What intrigued you, and at what point in time did this just cause you to say, well, this is what I want to do with my life? Because you're spending the larger portion, as both of you know, of your life focused on this subject. What drove that? Was there a time that it just struck you that this is what you wanted to do, or what? And I'll start with you, Dr. McGillis.
So I grew up in the country. A lot of the farmers in that area were old dairy producers, and so as they got out of the industry, the trees grew up, and that was my backyard, playing in the forest, and I enjoyed that. Now my dad is a chemical engineer, was in the glue industry, and he was a member of a group called TAPI, or the Technical Association of Paper and Pulp Industries. So as a kid, I saw a lot of magazines about forestry, and that looked like a fun way to go. But as Kobe will attest to, as an extension person, the crops and the trees are interesting, but it's the helping people that drives us into this field. So we're maybe technical experts in the trees or the crops, the soils, but helping people, I think, is more important than the technical background to be an extensionist. So.
And of course, Kobe, you've looked at everything according to your background, from Christmas trees, right on around, you name it, pretty much all over the state. Is this just something struck you? Especially, you're kind of to me, you're a young guy. So.
Well, I grew up in Ashe County, North Carolina, in the mountains. My grandfather owned a sawmill, and I was at the sawmill in the summertime from the time I was big enough to to help. My first job was banding slabs at the sawmill, and kind of worked my way up to off-bearing lumber, as we called it up there. But just always loved the outdoors, and always loved to be around trees, and spent a lot of time with my grandpa, and that's what got me into forestry. And as you go through life, things kind of, you might get off onto something else, but then it comes back around. And I've worked in Christmas trees and field crops, and now back to my first passion, which is forestry. So
when we look at Colby's comment, Dr. McGillis, about working at the sawmills and those kinds of things, the dynamic of the numbers of mills that we saw at one time has changed. Has technology driven that a lot?
It certainly has, and also the efficiency of those sawmills. We produce roughly the same amount of lumber we did when we had twice as many sawmills. So getting bigger, getting larger, getting more efficient has driven a lot of that. Now what's hurt us on that side, as we speak a lot for the landowners who are growing the trees, they're price takers. They're at the bottom of the market. And so the more sawmills competing for their lumber, the better off the price they typically get. Now, with fewer sawmills, that price differential is not nearly as great. So it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that we are more efficient. There are fewer people employed in that industry, and then some of the competition is not as ripe as it had been before the recession. So we kind of keep an ear to that, but that is true. We have less sawmills than ever. But as a result, our logging crews are probably as efficient or more so than they ever have been, and safer, fortunately, than they have been. So
we're going to take our first break, and we're going to come back and want to drive into some key points about forestry and the forestry industry here in North Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. We'll be back in a moment. We're talking with two experts in the field of forestry in North Carolina. Hope you enjoy this program. Call a friend.
You're out for an evening on the town. Finally a chance to relax and forget that you left your front door completely unlocked. Fortunately, you just installed a security system from Star Communications. With just your cell phone, you can check on your house, lock it down, light it up, and get back to relaxing.
You forgot to put Buster in his crate.
Unfortunately, we can't help with that. Security and automation from Star Communications. Call today to find out more.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're talking to Dr. Mark McGillis. We're talking with Mr. Colby Lambert, both timber people here in the state, North Carolina State University. Dr. McGillis, you are an Extension Associate Professor at North Carolina State University. And Colby, you travel in 30 plus counties and use a lot of rubber, I guess, up and down the road, just trying to talk to people about timber and timber business. And the first segment we talked about kind of how you got into that interest level. But I want to kind of move, if we can, and talk a bit about what oftentimes folks in the area here, I know it's referred to academically as forestry, but most of the time people in eastern North Carolina call it the woods.
The woods.
The woods. How many acres of woods have you got? Or normally, is that what you guys get? Because I don't get a lot of the forestry thing. But forestry is such a huge industry. When we look at that, the value of what people have in their woods or their forest land is critical. How do you determine something like that, Colby? I mean, if you've got 20 acres, 200 acres, or 2,000 acres, is there a process? Maybe either one of you or both of you could address that. How do you know if you've got X number of dollars per acre?
Well, the easiest way is to hire a consulting forester, and they will go in and do a timber appraisal, and those appraisals are based off of a sample. They can't realistically measure every tree that's out there, but they take a statistical sample, and then they will use current market conditions through their network of folks that they work with, through comparable timber sales, just like you would appraise real estate. And they do an appraisal of that tract of land and the trees that's on there, and gives you a real value of what's out there.
Now, do they look at species of tree, the poplar versus pine versus oak? Does each one of those have different values when the timber person looks at it, or the appraiser?
It's generally broken out into pine saw timber, pine pulpwood, pine chip and saw, and then hardwood saw timber. Sometimes you can get more specific depending on what species are out there, whether it's soft hardwoods or oak saw timber, that sort of thing. So it can be broken out into different things based on market availability, market conditions. There's different ways of valuing that timber.
Dr. Margolis, one of the things that often hits people when we listen to Colby and the folks that, like you said, a professional that goes out and I'll call them tree counters. They count the trees. They come back and say, well, on your 20 acres, maybe you've got, I don't know, I'm just going to throw a number out. It's probably a ridiculous number. Say you got $40,000 of value. The first thing that often response from the landowner, I'm doing the math, and 40% out, I'm going to end up getting anywhere from 30 to 40% value by time taxes and all these kinds of things. How do you come up with a rational, reasonable decision to sell that timber?
Okay, so getting back to a few of the things that Colby said, how old your timber is, how large it is, size-wise, the condition that it's in, and how close you are to a mill or a marketplace that wants it. That's a good way to approach it. Right now, timber is in scarce supply in certain markets, and so people may actually knock on your door and tell you they're interested in their timber. Many other landowners are approached by a mailer or get a phone call, say we're interested in your timber. Those tend to be cold calls, and the folks on the other side of the line may not know the value of the timber. They'll go out and look at it maybe the same day that you will look at it. So getting an independent appraisal, as Colby recommended, is a good way to go. But we can't tell you over the phone whether your property is worth $250 an acre, $1,250 an acre, or maybe as much as $4,000 an acre without seeing it. So satellite imagery helps a little bit to get us in the ballpark, but actually going out and touching the trees is very important.
They literally measure the tree with a tape measure. Is that how they do it, or is there another way that?
Well, generally they use diameter tapes. They use different methods of measuring the heights, either a clinometer or sometimes some of the new laser range finders that have capabilities of measuring heights. And again, and a lot of it is done, experience. They'll just try, they'll do a cruise, and that a lot of guys are good enough, if they're been in a business a while, they can measure diameters and heights pretty close by eye. They'll use a tape to get them started and then go from there with it.
And this is one of those questions that often folks look at from different perspectives, but the investment idea of transferring land that's open land back to woods land or forest land is kind of for folks that grew up on farms like myself and many of our listeners probably. They saw a lot of land being cleared to be used for farmland. Now they hear that there's an interest in replanting that land for trees. How do you balance that value, Dr. Margolis, when you're thinking, well, I've got, say, 50 acres, I think I'm putting it in trees. Well, 5 decades ago, we took the trees off so we could grow tobacco on it, which was a big cash crop. Tell us how do you deal with that financial decision?
So a lot of it is a personal decision, as you said. If it relates back to when Grandpa cleared the land, or we go back before that. Right now, the economics are definitely in favor of agriculture. So we've actually seen timberland come out of production to square up fields and to improve the acreage or increase the acreage that's available. So currently, I think we've got the recent estimates in the last year some of our best agricultural land may be bringing $100 to $150 an acre in crop rentals, and our forestry acreage would be difficult to do $30 to $50 an acre in annual equivalent. Not that we can rent forest land for an annual fee, but when we take that whole investment and carry it out for a whole rotation or the length of a crop, it's going to be closer to a third to a fifth of what agriculture could produce. So our folks who have a gut feeling that they don't want to plant their lands back to forestry have good business sense in that regard. Right now, forests occur on lands that can't be used for other productive uses in many cases, whether that's agriculture, pasture land, or some of the livestock operations that we have. So forests go where people don't have a better use for the land. So our job as extensionists are to help folks put in just enough investment to get reasonable returns from those lands, and then have something to pass on to their next generation. Because as we interview landowners, their top priority is to have a legacy to hand over to the next generation. So if Colby and I can help out and get folks a forest management plan, get on a course for improved management, then that's what we're here for.
And of course, I know both of you are aware in North Carolina. If you look back, some of the folks I've had on that are historians remind me that North Carolina was known for its value with pine timber, not only just for the timber, but even more so the tar, the pitch or the turpentine from the trees was actually a huge value to ship owners and shipbuilders during the day. Has pine and pine timber continued to be driving the market in our area of the state, say east of 95?
Yeah, generally pine is probably one of our biggest products coming out of the woods, especially in eastern North Carolina.
Is a market in a pine something that you would recommend? For example, you mentioned for generations going forward, somebody reaches a certain age and they've got a number of acres of property and say, well, I want to have something left here that my grandchildren can engender in their grandchildren for maybe for 30 or 40 years. Is pine the tree you would recommend, or is it a hardwood, or how do you determine what you would put on that property?
Right, it's going to depend on the land's capability. If you have wet natured soil, or if you stand out there in the wintertime and you're in water, that's probably not a pine site. But pine, as a rule, can grow twice as fast, and in years past has returned twice as much as the hardwoods. So that speedy growth and the higher value in the marketplace gives it a fourfold decision to go with pine versus hardwood, as a rule.
And of course, one of the things I think with North Carolina State, you guys have done a fantastic job with it is, as you just said, the speed of the growth of that tree. You've got some species now that it seems to me like in 7 or 8 years they're 3 or 4 stories tall. That's phenomenal growth. But is there a trade-off with that, Colby, as far as the quality of the timber?
There is. A lot of those trees that are growing that fast are certainly going to have some limitations on strength of that wood as far as structural lumber goes. And so a lot of those trees are more suited for, say, a pulpwood market versus some of your more structural timber markets. There definitely is some trade-offs going from growing wood that fast.
Most folks in the area are familiar with pine in the sense of short leaf and long leaf pine. Is there a particular kind of pine that you would recommend a landowner for legacy purposes to plant?
That's really going to be a personal decision. There are some recent or renewed interest in the species that haven't done so well because of the economics or our land history, but longleaf is included in that. Short leaf, not our loblolly pines, but even a smaller needled pine. As we get into the drier upper coastal plain lands, it was a typical tree in the past. So those may have greater longevity than our loblolly pines and an easy choice for some landowners.
We're going to take another break, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a moment. Call a friend, stay tuned. We're talking about forestry, talking about woods land here in North Carolina. We'll be back in one moment.
Whether it's video, voice, internet, or cellular, Star Communications connects you to the things you love. It's what we do and have done for over 50 years. Star Communications, your local technology company.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank all those folks at the radio station mentions us each and every week. The morning show with Grandpa, Nolan Z, the L-Man, and of course Wayne Weeks with the Gospel Hour each and every day. Nicole, we thank you for mentioning the show on the Country Store. Robert Stroud, Saturday afternoon with the Boogie Shoes Radio Network. Robert, we thank you for mentioning this show. Today, we're talking with Dr. Mark Megalis, and we're talking with Mr. Colby Lambert. We're talking about trees and woods in North Carolina. So, gentlemen, I want to kind of toss this out. One of the things for our listeners that may be listening on the radio or watching the show on TV, the first thing you say, well, look, I don't have a lot of land. I mean, what does this really mean to me? But timber really affects everybody's life in one way or the other, whether it's a community development, whether you're teeing off at a golf course somewhere in some of our pristine golf areas in this immediate area or any part of the state. All of it has an impact. How do you get folks to understand that from the classroom level, Dr. Megalis, to the side of the road where you are a lot of times, Colby, when you're out there talking with individuals? How do you get them to understand, look, it don't matter whether you own 2 acres or no acres, forestry and trees impacts your life?
So just thinking about life without a forest product is pretty difficult. From the get up in the morning, the toothpaste that you use to brush with, all the paper products that we go through during a day's time, and then some of the fragrances in our deodorants and the flavorings in our food. There are trees in every aspect of our life. Now we're sitting here at a solid wood desk, and it's easy to know that wood is around us. Most of our homes and homes that can last centuries are built with wood. But just even today's technological age, we use paper more than we ever have before, and that comes from a tree. Now, kids are taught that recycling is important, and we can get 2 or 3 uses out of virgin raw material or that wood pulp. Eventually, though, we need a new tree to replace it. And then finally, the most important to our life here on Earth is the oxygen that the trees give off. And so right now the trees in America, if we can keep them healthy, are offsetting our emissions from our global lifestyle. That's the cars, that's the heating, the electricity we use. About 13% of what we're emitting, trees are already scrubbing from the atmosphere. So we're looking into the future. Can we make trees even more productive, or can we maybe use less polluting type energy so that trees don't have to work so hard?
With that commentary, has there been any research that would show there would be a replacement for that 2x4 that holds a house together, or that 2x10 used for flooring? Is there other materials that have been looked at, and is there any viability in anything yet that would replace the timber?
So I can speak a little bit about the energy it costs to produce a substitute. We can do them, and there's a group out of the Pacific Northwest called Quorum, and they have looked at the energy balance of wood, and it's hard to beat anywhere. That's compared to concrete and steel. So, and then just the benefit of putting that stuff back in the landfill is all been put into these equations. So we don't have a substitute for wood. What we have done is come up with alternatives to make wood out of younger and younger trees, whether by glue or other mechanism, so that the technology is moving us to use trees that are a renewable resource even more efficiently into the future. So that's kind of exciting.
Colby, you mentioned your grandfather was a timber person, a sawmill, and some of the things you did there. How efficient have we got in utilizing various parts of that tree once it gets to the mill? Because I think the average person listening or watching this show would say, well, when I think of trees, I think of not only shade and some of the things Dr. Margolis talked about, but I think primarily of boards, of 2x4s or 2x10s. But there's a lot of pieces to a tree. So has our efficiency in using those pieces improved, and to what degree have they improved?
It's improved dramatically. Now when a tree goes into a mill, it's scanned, and computer software figures out the most efficient utilization of that tree from round to square boards. So in my grandfather's day, that was done by their eye. They figured out through various cuttings and turning the log how to get the most efficient use out of it. Now it's done by computers. So the computers can scan that log and figure out exactly what size boards and how many boards, and utilize that log the most efficient way possible. And every part of that log is utilized, from the sawdust to the bark to the slabs that's left over. It's all chipped up and used, if not for a product, to fuel the sawmill itself. So it's becoming extremely efficient.
Is there a volume of the timber that we use, especially chip products, that's used in, for example, the poultry areas in this part of the state, and North Carolina as a whole is a huge poultry industry, and they use a lot of chip, from what I guess they're still using that for their birds to walk on and that kind of thing.
Right.
Is that
Shavings.
a big industry?
So the shavings are a byproduct of planing a board flat. So they're probably one of the highest value per ton of products that come out of a tree these days. And when that price went up, then we've started looking at alternatives. So those alternatives may be fast-growing grasses, but we needed something that's dry, that, as you say, the birds can walk on and do their business on, and then move on back to, it can be recycled and land applied afterwards. But yeah, I think we're talking about $40 or $80 a ton for that stuff. So it's already been dried, it's been flaked off a board, and we call those shavings. Sawdust used to be, getting back to the old days, it was not unusual to find a mountain of sawdust next to a sawmill. And when we managed the land, we had to be careful about not setting that afire. But I've been to a couple of tracts that had 50 and 60-year-old trees growing in the sawdust pile. So they'd been there a while. But as a rule, I think with the quarter, when we cut with quarter-inch saws, circular saws, we'd leave a quarter of the trees in the woods as sawdust.
Wow.
And even more so when Colby was taking slabs off that's what we used to heat mountain homes and a bunch of other things.
Now we're taking, I think it's 1/8 of an inch with the bandsaw technology now, taking 1/8 of an inch off it at
So it
each
actually
cut
saves
instead
wood.
of a quarter of an inch. Yes, sir. You're able to utilize even more of that log than you were before.
And some of that sawdust is going back in to make particle boards. When I worked as a young man like Colby in the Piedmont area, much of that sawdust was fueling the brick industry. So we had many industries that grew up hand in hand, where the excess sawdust went and was used in the kilns to make bricks. So the Lee County area, the capital of the brick world, it grew up with the pine trees all around it, and the industry supported that.
As we talk about this, the natural kind of flow of this conversation seems to be moving to some point that we must talk about conservation and conservancy as it relates to timber and forest lands in North Carolina, because of the unbelievable growth. Wake County is an example of that. Other smaller areas are experiencing growth now. how does the state deal with that, and how does folks like you, Dr. Margolis, that looks at it on a large scale basis with the state teach that? And Colby, with you out there every day, how do you transfer that information to the guy that says, look, this 20 acres or 200 acres is my tract of land. If I want to cut everything down and grow nothing on it, I'm going to do it. How does that conversation work? And this might go into after the next break because this is a pretty huge question.
Well, in my case, I mean, you know, I have worked as a consultant when I first got out of school too, and you know, when you're working with landowners, ultimately the decision is theirs on what they want to do with the land. It's their land, but you know, you try to give them recommendations and good recommendations on options of what they can and can't do, or you know, what they should or should not do, not what they can and can't. Because if he wants to cut all the trees off his land and leave it like that, you know, that's his land. His or her land, they can do what they want to. But you know, as an educator, it's our job to give them the options that they have and recommendations as to what will be their best route to go.
So JW, as many folks might remember, in 1990, when the census was taken in our state, we went from a rural to an urban state. So now we've got 26 years experience as being an urbanized state, but it takes a long time to forget that rural legacy. And we think there'll always be land, but there might not always be land. Each new interstate that goes through or bypass is going to eat up a portion of the land, and I think all of us love that if it gets us to the beach faster. Mm-hmm. And so, but as others find North Carolina to be as welcoming as we did, or I did when I came here 30 or 35 years ago, we have to realize that those new people need a place to stay. And so we can either jam them in a little closer, or we can be more efficient in some of our planning. And I think the state has been very aggressive in terms of offering incentives to help buy out unique properties that are important. But even the military, who is a big player in our state, is getting behind some of these actions. We could talk more about that.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about that as we come back from our next break. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening today. Call a friend coming up toward our last break here. We'll be back in a moment.
What? How can that be? No way someone broke in and stole my TV. Unless I want to install steel bars, I'll call the experts in security. Star Communications is the one that I can trust to get the job done.
Yeah, the only thing worse than that is not feeling safe in your own home or business.
Call Star Communications now. We're your local security experts, from alarms and monitoring to automation and personal protection.
Word.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Very interesting show today. We're coming on our last segment. We want to thank you for being with us. Call a friend, tune in. We're going to try to get you some phone numbers in case you want to call somebody as it relates to the conversation about forestry and forestry issues in North Carolina. Got two people very well qualified to talk to you about that. It's Dr. Mark Margolis, Associate Extension Professor at North Carolina State University, and Colby Lambert, who has had, it sounds like, Colby, your life has been spent somewhere around a tree, either on a sawmill or somewhere in somebody's woods, as we would say, checking lumber out. I want to kind of move quickly so we don't lose this planning piece, Dr. Margolis, which is critically important. Is there such a thing as it being too late to plan? For example, we can pick up on this at any juncture, but it just struck me is that a lot of folks that may be listening to this show, especially on radio, could be listening and think, well, you know, I'm in my 70s or 80s and I've got, I don't know, 2,000 acres and there's 1,000 of it in timber. I don't know whether I need to worry about planning or not. When do you start planning, and how do you plan?
It's never too late to start planting, or planning for how your estate is going to transfer to the next generation. And it may be subsequent generations beyond that. So in the last year and a half, a colleague and I have been fortunate to receive a grant through the U.S. military to do conservation planning with farm folks. Now, you might ask, what does Uncle Sam want with my open land? And the answer is pretty simple. Farming and forestry are light-free land uses. That means they're not sending any light upwards. And so the military that doesn't want to be on the land necessarily, but wants to travel around at night and do night training, needs a darker eastern North Carolina, even to our Piedmont. And so they're willing to look at, as we said, incentives or voluntary programs where landowners can start making these estate plans. And in most cases, the military and the landowners can see eye to eye. They both want the land to remain in farm and forest. So we've gotten a lot of mileage out of that, done several trainings, produced a booklet that folks can ask about and we can send their way, called Conserving Working Land. So that's a goal where folks have come together and look to support forestry and farming, agriculture as we know it, and agriculture as it will become in the future.
Can communities come together and do that? For example, if it's not one person, say that owns 2,000 acres, maybe it's 300 people and all of their land is contiguous, and they come together and say, look, we want to get involved in a program to ensure that this stays in kind of a woodland environment.
They can work collectively. We found that it's oftentimes harder to get two people to agree, let alone two people in their own family.
Yeah.
So if we can move forward on a unique plan, that's kind of the secret.
Financial incentives there?
There are some, and it depends on the program that you get involved with. But certainly we have tax incentive for folks who want to donate perhaps the development rights on the property. Keep it in farm, maybe receive compensation for that, but certainly a tax deduction. Right now, our tax laws, at least at the federal level, show that 95% of landowners are not going to have an estate tax problem, meaning it's going to cost them when they pass land on. But in order to do that without any taxes, they need to have a plan. And that's normally we can move almost $5.5 million worth of value from one generation to the next without, that's called our lifetime exemption. And there's no tax on that. But where we run into problem is when the surviving spouse now has that first estate and her own estate and may get above this $10 million figure. So that's when we need to plan. But shy of that, just having open communications with the next generation so they know what your plans are, what your goals and aspirations are for the property. That's the place to start. So there's a lot of hard skills that we can teach people, numbers, but the soft skills, the communication part, is usually the hardest place to get started, but the most important.
Colby, I sit here and I'm listening to Dr. Margolis, and I'm thinking as I'm looking at you, we've had conversations about this whole generational issue on a multiple number of subjects on this show, and particularly as it relates to timber. I'm thinking now, does the millennial group of people that I'm thinking that you probably fall well into that group, did they look differently upon estate planning and timber and forestry as opposed to folks my age and maybe older?
Certainly.
I was thinking they would. So.
Certainly so. In most cases, you know, they're probably not thinking about it much at all, unless they've been around grandparents or parents that,
like yourself,
that have, you know, that instill that love for the land in them. And that's, you know, as I travel around the state and been to a lot of workshops on estate planning and put some on myself, you see most of the property owners, but you don't see their kids or their grandkids there with them. And that's the piece that you go back to what Mark was saying, that, you know, communication is key. You know, if you're not communicating with the next generation what your plans are, you know, that's where the stumbling blocks can be in an estate plan and how that needs to move forward. So it's critical for us, for me and our group, as well as the landowners, is to get their kids involved, get their grandkids involved, and make sure that they're a part of that process. It is a touchy subject when you're talking about death, but it's certainly a subject that needs to be communicated.
But Mark, back to your point, that's critical as Colby was just pointing out. At some point in time, you have to sit down and look at that and either make an acquisition in an affirmative way in a legal instrument, or you got to feel comfortable with this is what I want to see happen to it, or this is what I want my future to be. With that said, when you engage also local ordinances, commissioners, town councils, and others, are you often engaged with those folks to talk about ordinances that ensure forest land in certain areas and to help with various things of that nature? Do you guys get involved in that?
So I don't specifically, but my colleague has, and they've created a database of ordinances that may impact forestry, and that is available on our website. More recently, the North Carolina Forestry Association has helped push through a Right to Manage Forestry Act, and that gives some leeway on individuals who have a forest management plan. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about forest management plans, but that ensures the community managers and enforcement entities that folks are there in a legitimate forestry business. They're following a plan, they're following best management practices, and they should be able to and can legally conduct a forestry operation within the jurisdictional area of many communities. So that's on the books. It may vary from region to region, but we do have some publications that can explain that. And that's really, when we talk about a consulting forester, that's somebody who can work on your behalf to make sure that your operations can take place regardless of where they are, rural areas, on the urban fringe, or actually inside some cities.
And we're going to try to post telephone numbers and stuff at the bottom of the screen for those folks viewing this on TV. But if you can, let's give folks a telephone number and maybe a web address. You mentioned there is abundant amount of information on the web, but in case you don't have access, again, call one of your millennial grandchildren. They can find it for you, I'm sure. But give us a telephone number that either you could be reached, or how they get up with either one of you guys.
Well, for myself, probably the easiest way for them is to start at their local county extension office. We have offices in all 100 counties, so if they go to their local extension office, they'll be glad to get in touch with me. But they can also reach me at 910-814-6041.
Okay, that's 910-814-6041.
Yes, sir.
Colby Lambert.
That's my office in Harnett County.
Okay. And for folks, and for example, in Sampson County, to your point, I think it's 592-7161. Eileen Coit is the director here, and it's been,
yes, sir.
We've been fortunate to have her on this show before. Dr. McGillis.
So I work for all those extension offices and those county directors, so they can reach me directly by calling 919-513-1202. And that automatically records a message, and we talked about technology that sends me an email with a message attached. Okay. So,
and the website does have an abundant amount of information. If you go to the website and give that website out, either one of you.
The easiest one is www.ces for Cooperative Extension Service, .ncsu for our home institution, and then .edu.
We're going to again try to put that at the bottom of the screen for the TV viewers, but I did want to get that out. And again, if you are in a county listening, wherever your county may be that you're listening to this show, or if you view it, just go to the Cooperative Extension Office and ask to speak to the person in charge of forestry there. You can mention Colby Lambert if you're in this section of the state, about 30 plus counties, and they'll reach you there, or they could call your number. And of course, Dr. McGillis, you continue to not only teach, but look at the entire state and its inclusivity with forestry here. About a 10-second close for each one of you.
Just like to say that, if anyone does have questions or needs help with anything related to forestry, certainly get in touch with your local extension office, and we'll be glad to help you with any needs you have or get you the help you need.
Okay.
Just get a good forest management plan and follow it, and you'll have your goals accomplished, and we can start planning your estate after you get that done.
Well, best wishes with this $22+ billion state budget this year.
Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you again next week on the radio, and may God bless.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion regarding this or any episode, please send your emails to weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.